I would also want to say two things. First of all, we are in the territory of the Mississaugas of Green Credit, and it's important to remember that because those are those people who created an opportunity for most of the rest of us to be here. And as you would have seen in the Do the Math video, you saw some Canadian First Nations people, particularly Chief Bill Erasmus from the Northwest Territories, who has been very active in the campaign, along with many others, and we know that there's Aboriginal leadership in all parts of the country, but particularly in Alberta and in New Brunswick. Secondly, I want to say that this church is a very special church because it has pioneered in ways that perhaps very few congregations have. It's about 6 years ago, and perhaps Ron and some others can remind me the exact date, when we had Alana Mitchell come and speak to us about a book that had not yet been published, called Ceasing. And I would have to say, sitting on that Saturday morning at the back of that church, it changed my life. And I say that very deliberately because I'd spent almost, since the late 80s working on the issue of climate change. I chaired the first Environment Committee of the House of Commons, whose primary task from 1989 to 1993 was to do an in-depth, groundbreaking study on what climate change was all about. And the interesting thing is that most of the key findings that we came up with then are even more valid today, in spite of the fact that people thought we were making a very radical statement about a 20% reduction in CO2 to below 1990 levels. But we missed one thing. We thought everything had to do with the atmosphere, and it didn't. We took for granted that the oceans were an inexhaustible sink that could absorb whatever spare CO2 and other things we were prepared to let soak into it. Alana's book and lots of other studies over the last decade have proven that to be dead wrong. And you saw Bill McGibbon talk about what's happened in the Arctic. He could have gone on to talk about the warming of the oceans, the greater acidity, the rising of the oceans, and the way in which we have made the oceans sick as well. So today I want to say that I think we're really engaged in a groundbreaking exercise here. And we have 4 people to help us think our way through this, because this is, Bill may say that this is not radical stuff, but it is radical stuff if you think about the fact that we have become, I use the word addicted, so addicted to the use of fossil fuels, we don't think we can break free of that addiction. That's what we're going to be pushing ourselves to think about today. Now, our first speaker I just met, but I've heard many good things, and I read a bit about it before I came here, and you can find his bio if you all have this sheet. But Fletcher, as was suggested by Lucy, is the Executive Director of GreenFaith, which is doing some pioneering work, or some pioneering work in the United States, and we're going to be doing more work, I think, with that organization over the next little while. And Fletcher will give us an insight into what he has discovered in the work that he's doing. Fletcher?
Many thanks, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here, and congratulations on such a super turnout. And I know from a lot of experience that these kinds of events don't happen without a lot of people volunteering a lot of time. And so thank you for inviting me to be part of what I think is the place to be in terms of a conversation about climate change. And I also want to thank you for inviting a U.S. citizen sort of north of the border. I live and work in New Jersey, which, as many of you may know, is the sort of butt of all of the pollution jokes in the United States. And I remember about 4 or 5 years ago going out to speak to an environmental event in Colorado, which is much more pristine than New Jersey is, and getting up and announcing that I worked for an interfaith environmental organization that was based in New Jersey, and people actually started to laugh. So you all have neither laughed nor given off catcalls yet, so I appreciate it very much, and it's good to be working on this together.
We are closer to New Jersey, that's why.
Sorry?
I said we are closer to New Jersey than Colorado.
That's true, that's true. So at any rate, I'm going to go through a number of slides. I'll be very glad to share these slides with Lucy, so take notes if you want, but you'll be able to get access to them. This is our mission, and we do a whole range of different kinds of work and programming with faith communities on the environment, but we're talking now about a campaign that we launched about a year and a quarter ago called Divest and Reinvest Now, which is our effort to mobilize faith communities on this, on climate issues. And I think that it's really important to be quite direct consistently about the genesis of these divestment efforts, and to be very direct and clear that the genesis of these is a context of desperation. And I think it's very important not to understate or underestimate that, because we're way past the safe zone in terms of CO2 emissions levels and the CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and the speed at which we are responding or not to this. And so we're in a desperate situation with this. And this got started in college campuses, focusing first on coal, but then morphing into an effort to get college campuses and universities to divest. We heard and saw the piece about Bill's article, and have heard about the campuses and the growing number of municipalities. I think the good news is that this debate, within a very short period of time, has grown significant legs in the faith community, as it should. I was in college in the 80s. I took part in faith-based, in campus-based divestment efforts around apartheid. I think that it is a uniquely powerful tool and mechanism for shifting the ethos and the culture that surrounds these debates, and I think it's vital right now. I didn't always think that. When we first thought about this a year or two ago and started thinking about, do we want to jump into divestment, I really wanted to sort of think through and feel my way through this to see, does this really hold water as an approach to this issue? And so what I'm going to do is share a little bit with you of the path that we took, thinking this through in the hope that that will be useful for all of you. And we right now share a lot of resources and help with this kind of organizing work, and I'll say more about that later on. So when people hear about divestment from fossil fuels, they have one of several reactions. Some are galvanized, some are skeptical, many are skeptical. They're skeptical because they're not clear that it can make a difference. They're skeptical because they question whether it's financially responsible, the fiduciary duty argument. We hear from many people, well, it's the wrong target. You ought to get the government to enact policy. Those are some of the sort of skeptical reactions we get. We see a certain amount of what I call divestment fatigue. The idea basically that liberal activists at the drop of a hat now use divestment as a tactic in any number of different campaigns. And within the Jewish community, because of the boycott, divest, and sanctions campaign that's been going on colleges and universities, and in some faith communities over a period of time, we found that the word divestment is a very contentious and loaded one in Jewish communities. In the U.S., we've seen only a small number of rabbis who've been willing to speak out publicly and use that word. And we need, as a multi-faith community, to be mindful of that. And we also have run into a lot of reaction where there's a preference for shareholder advocacy, and I'll say more about that, and I think we'll have a good dialogue about that today. We thought when we started looking at this about what's the history around the ethical use of money in faith communities, and obviously it's a long one. This is far from the first time that faith communities have fought about bringing our beliefs and our moral values to bear on the use of money. And when you look across the religious spectrum in Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist traditions and more, you see that this whole list of industries, tobacco, alcohol, weapons manufacturing, prison construction management, gambling, financial service firms, pharmaceuticals, adult entertainment, pork production, I mean, all of these industries have been the focus of divestment campaigns in different faith communities. So arguably, faith communities have been having this kind of conversation for centuries. It's not new to us. There's a good history of what the sort of guideposts are when we do these kinds of conversations. And I think also we are, along with the college and university sector, one of the places within society where these conversations can happen with a kind of breadth and moral depth and a sort of multifaceted depth. And that's really important. One of the themes that I'm going to emphasize over and over again is that regardless of the outcome, having this conversation in a serious way where you don't just have it and the investment people stand up and say you can't do it, it's, essentially get off our turf. That's not adequate for religious communities in terms of their response. Lots of traditionally religious communities are having it that way, especially at the sort of larger denominational level where there's more at stake, arguably. But that's not enough for us. We owe our heritage, our identity, something much deeper than that. There are three reasons, essentially, from my perspective, that faith communities choose to divest. And I'm going to go through those quickly now. The first is that they see grave, large-scale harm that results from the operation of an industry or as the result of government policy. So in South Africa, which is an example that was in the film, there you had a government that had policies that were morally repugnant and causing systematic destruction to the human community. And you had certain industries which represented a leverage point in relationship to that government. And so the target of the divestment was obviously the industry. The ultimate target was the government policy. With tobacco, that's a place where the divestment efforts were targeted directly at an industry because of its core product. Cigarettes are not sort of peripheral. They're not an add-on to the tobacco industry. They're the heart of it. And so the divestment campaign in that case focused there. And what faith communities have looked at before they've chosen to divest is this large-scale harm that's getting caused? Is this unarguably very, very serious, grave injury that's being caused? And if the answer is yes, this reason has sufficed for some faith groups to carry out divestment, and ironically perhaps some of the longest standing active divestment campaigns or non-investment campaigns that exist are within the conservative Christian movement, which won't touch tobacco and alcohol stocks. So this reason, this sort of first reason, is enough for some, but not for most. So the second reason that figures into faith communities thinking about when to divest is what I call intractable resistance. And that essentially means if you run up against a government or an industry that for any number of reasons simply digs its heels in and refuses to change and to stop creating the problem. So again, in South Africa, you've got a sort of a government that was just not going to change, and there have been years, decades of engagement through any number of channels to try to make that happen. Climate change clearly fits that model. Now, this is a tricky piece because religious groups rightly have a very well-established preference for some sort of dialogical engagement and dialogical solution around issues. We prefer, in the way that we do things, not to just sort of burn the bridge, so to speak. And I am good friends with and great admirers of the work of the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility in the U.S., which is the sort of lead U.S. interfaith center for shareholder advocacy and engagement. And if you look at faith communities' work, the sense is that you've got to exhaust the other alternatives. Divestment's not your first tool. And if it is, that's really going off a bit half-cocked. So you've got to do the legislative advocacy, you've got to do the community organizing, you've got to do the outreach and education, you've got to do the shareholder engagement. And another thing that has influenced faith communities' decisions and thinking about divestment is not only do all of those things get happen, and you still run into the intractable resistance, but in some cases you get industries or governments that actively and disingenuously and dishonestly push back. So with the tobacco piece, you have the withholding of or the falsifying of data and of research and of information. With climate change, we've seen the climate skeptics bit. It's not a good sign. That rightly sort of colors the perspective of faith communities when they look at this question of divestment. Who are you dealing with? Are they going to deal with you in a responsible manner? Are they a worthy dialogue partner, so to speak? And so that becomes an issue. And then the third reason that faith groups have divested, and at the end of the day, when groups start with divestment, often this represents the sort of first place that they go emotionally. It ends up in many cases being, when these real decisions get made, it ends up often being the third consideration, but it's the opportunity to try to redefine society's moral code. and to say that because there's grave harm and because there's intractable resistance, we must, to be true to our identity, to maintain integrity, we must do this. And we must express why we're doing it, because that's part of our mission and our responsibility. And what I would say is that, I'll say a little bit more of this. To me, the whole process of divestment within faith communities is a highly relational one and a highly social process, because faith communities have to talk these things through at length with people who've known each other often for many years, talking with each other, agreeing, disagreeing uncomfortably. When I was involved with the South Africa work 25 years ago, what I saw was that the first reaction was it was fairly easy to ignore calls for divestment because they were new. And that's an understandable first reaction. There was a certain amount of sort of minimizing or ridiculing to some degree. This is, just college students. They don't really know what's good for them, that sort of thing. But after a while, if a divestment movement develops some momentum and demonstrates resolve and demonstrates a morally plausible argument, then there's a sort of an invisible tipping point that happens when all of a sudden a public leader will get up and be moderately dismissive of the call for divestment, and what used to just be a non-issue as a statement all of a sudden strikes people the wrong way, because what it represents is an insensitivity to the real grave threat that's at hand. And that's the kind of moment that divestment campaigns can create in a way that is near unique. And I think that's very important for this. Because what divestment represents is it's saying, let's take a fairly extraordinary step. And let's essentially refuse, in the case of fossil fuels, to say that 10% of the global stock market is very simply off the table. So that's not, in my opinion, that's not a small step. Some divestment advocates will try to make it sound as though this is easy, let's just do it. Create the demand and the financial services sector will solve the problem for us. They'll have fossil-free products. Maybe, but I do think that there's some value in recognizing that there is some risk in this kind of strategy, and that it may represent a sacrifice of some kind. That maybe it will mean either the risk of moderately lower returns, although the data hasn't sort of shown up on that. Maybe it will increase management fees for portfolios. And I was a parish priest for 10 years. I've balanced church budgets. I know how tight they are, and I know that it's, my guess is that, you all in Canada have the same struggles we do here, we do in the US, which is that, church budgets, religious institutional budgets are tight and often shrinking. And so I think that, to be honest about the divestment piece, and part of where the sort of moral strength of it comes is to recognize that there may well be a price tag attached to it, and to look at that honestly, and to say that this is important enough that as a faith community we are willing to step up and to pay that price. Now the price may be as both modest but meaningful as a certain amount of the time and attention of the leadership of the faith community, which is most faith communities' scarcest commodity. The time and attention of the leadership is really valuable. Nonetheless, you can sort of get, and I think that the success of faith-based divestment stuff depends on making this argument plausible for what I would call moral moderates. And not having it be something that appeals only to, in this case, the left wing of the community, but to be something that the moral moderates, even if they don't agree, they have to engage it seriously. So from our perspective, fossil fuel meets these three criteria that I've talked about. I think they meet it quite clearly. And we also talk in terms of reinvestment, and some of the speakers later on today will talk specifically about that. In the US, religious facilities are what I call green laggards in terms of their energy efficiency and conservation, and a very legitimate form of reinvestment on the part of faith communities is to green up the operation of their own facility, tighten up their energy use, it's very easy in our experience to get 20 to 30% reductions in carbon footprints at faith communities with very minimal investments of resources. And so that's one form of reinvestment. There are others that we'll hear about later on. And for those who argue that engagement is important, I've found it useful to think in terms of something that happened with the South Africa piece. Again, there was an African-American minister named Leon Sullivan who promulgated the Sullivan Principles, which were, okay, if you're going to do business in South Africa, here's the way you've got to do it. And he set out criteria that would essentially have established a mini non-apartheid zone within an apartheid country. And I thought that became a useful tool. So maybe some principles for if you're going to talk about moral criteria for investment in fossil fuel companies. My feeling is you've got to stop making the problem worse. And that means no more funding for skeptics and across-the-board acceptance of mainstream scientific projections in terms of what you're basing your policies on. You've got to commit to be part of the solution, which means committing as a corporation to hit those targets in your products and services. And, I can't resist some form of what would be perceived as moralism, which is to have a bit of restitution, because I think, as we saw from tobacco, I just think that's, the world has become wealthy in many ways because of fossil fuel. These companies are massive, they're shareholders. I think that there needs to be some form of giving back. And so I said as a way of wrapping up, I'm not a fan of sort of downplaying the fact that there's some risk with this for faith communities. I think that it, in a sense, robs us of the real power of this debate if we try to sort of paper that over. I also think that this is a risk for institutions that are often fragile in terms of resources, and I don't take that for granted. We offer resources to help support this. It's been a lot of fun to connect with Lucy, and we're doing organizing. We're working now with leaders in probably 7 or 8 denominations in the US that are bringing resolutions through their process. And Lucy and I and some other folks from the UK and from Australia and New Zealand have been talking about organizing that's going on. In a very short time, this movement has spread rapidly in faith communities, and it should, and it will continue to do so. I'll close by saying that with divestment with South Africa, very, very few faith-based institutions eventually divested. A very large number had impassioned debates about it. And every bit as much as the ones that divested, the quality and genuineness of those debates matter in terms of moving the needle culturally on that issue. Divestment is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, in my opinion, in this case. What we need is a price, a strong price on carbon. But where I come from, literally, there is absolutely no hope of getting that at this point in time, given the makeup of our Congress. I learned a long time ago in the parish that if you want to have a good moral debate about something that really moves and changes people, you don't say to people, let's have a good moral debate. You talk about money, and then you get a good moral debate. That's what divestment does. Money is so dang important that people can't help themselves but get drawn into this debate, and that's the best hope that we've got. Because to return to the context of desperation, we're in a tough spot where there's a lot of suffering now and in the future. And I think that divestment, a vigorous divestment debate, represents the best way that faith communities can start to change where society is on that. So, many thanks.
Thank you, Fletcher, very much. And as you were speaking, not only did I recall things around the whole struggle, the anti-apartheid movement, I also was recalling even earlier when in the 70s, and there are people here in this room who were part of it, when there was big struggles for church folks, people of faith, on corporate responsibility. And I remember as a very much younger member, woman, attending large corporate meetings and arguing for that kind of corporate responsibility in terms of people's human rights in Latin America under fascist regimes. So there's lots of good stuff to draw on in terms of our history.